Good morning, good morning. Good morning, good morning. All right. I tell you, it feels amazing to see folks in our new space. I think this is probably most people's first time in our new space. We're excited about it, as you can tell. It's a little bit more space than our old space upstairs. We couldn't get rid of the columns, but the sight lines are generally better. And we're just really pleased to have you here with us this morning in the Edgerly Center for Civic Leadership. Again, good morning. My name is Orlando Watkins. I am the Vice President for Programs here at the Boston Foundation. I'd like to take a couple of minutes as we're getting started to thank a couple of folks. First of all, my friends at the Barr Foundation, Trevor and Kim, who are co-hosting this event with us today. I think we started talking with them about a year ago about our interest in leadership development and nonprofit capacity building. And it's just really exciting to see the partnership sort of evolve and get us to this point this morning. Because of the Barr Foundation support, we were able to give the authors of the Race to Lead report resources to do an additional analysis of the Massachusetts data in the Race to Lead report. And we think it's going to be sort of great foundational information as we continue this conversation moving on into the future. So thank you, the Barr Foundation, for your incredible partnership and support. I also wanted to thank the nonprofit effectiveness team, one of the teams that I manage here at the Boston Foundation, led by Jennifer Aronson, who you will hear from shortly. About a year and a half ago when I started the job, we started to have real explicit conversations about race and equity and valuing the lived experiences of the communities that we serve, thinking about how we show up as real partners, and even our willingness to have hard conversations about race. And this body of work that we're leaning into around diversity, equity, inclusion is sort of a real expression of my team, the program committee, and there's really the entire foundation's commitment to having these types of conversations. So Jennifer Aronson and your entire team, thank you for all of your leadership and work to make this day happen. As the Boston Community Foundation, we're invested in the success of nonprofit organizations and have been for 100 years. But 7-8 years ago, our board and staff made a more explicit commitment to focus on building the capacity and the effectiveness of the nonprofit sector. And so we launched a core strategy, nonprofit effectiveness core strategy, again, led by Jennifer Aronson. And the goal for that strategy is to support and strengthen effective and sustainable nonprofits. And our approach centers on three primary areas, and it is organizational capacity, resources, and leadership. I'm not going to go into all the details of all of those areas of work, but encourage you to go on our website and learn about this nonprofit effectiveness work. We think it's very important to make sure our nonprofit community is strong and healthy so we can do the work that we do for a community every day. So today's conversation is more about leadership. And as we all know, nonprofit leaders, are important drivers of change in the organizations and communities that they serve. As part of our nonprofit effectiveness strategy, we seek to develop, build, and strengthen the capacity of these leaders, recognize those leaders as incredible contributors to our community, and a real focus on building the leadership pipeline. As you will hear today, and I'm sure you all know, we have an issue with the pipeline of leaders that are coming behind the current set of leaders in many of the positions in our nonprofits. We specifically in our strategy invest in programs that prepare and train leaders throughout their careers, from college students first starting out in the sector to more established leaders. We know they also need support, training, and our attention. And as many of you might be aware, we are really on the brink of an incredible leadership turnover in the sector. Research has predicted that 78% of leaders are currently planning to retire or transition to another sector by 2020. And we all know that the number of leaders of color who look like the communities that we often serve is very thin, and so we have to do more work there. But this leadership transition represents a real opportunity for all of us to lean in, and that's why we are here today. Many of you may have attended our forum in the spring that we hosted here. It was focused on the Opportunity and Change report. The report was spearheaded by us in Third Sector New England and highlighted the challenges and structural barriers facing nonprofit leadership. The report was also a real call to action to nonprofit boards and staff and funders also to start conversations like the one we're having today about leadership transitions and for them to really look inward at issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today's forum is a continuation of that conversation. And today also marks the release of the Building Movement Project's powerful report, Race to Lead, which aims to rewrite the narrative around readiness and willingness of people of color to assume leadership roles within the nonprofit organization. I think when you read the report, it's really fascinating, the myth that leaders of color don't want to step into leadership positions. And I think the report points out that is not always true. Many of us actually aspire to many of these leadership positions. The report also implores nonprofits to focus on structural and organizational barriers and biases that may stifle opportunities for leaders of color. The last thing I'll say is that this DEI work is more than aspirational or ideal or a nice thing to do. We fundamentally believe that it is good for the sector, it's good for the work we are doing in community, so it is not a nice to do, it is a must do. And so with that, I'd like to say that I can look forward to leaning in with all of you on this work moving forward. The foundation is committed to it. And again, thank you all for being here this morning. So now I will turn it over to the report authors, Francis and Sam, who are co-directors of the Building Movement Project. They will walk us through the findings of the report. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So my name's Thomas-Breitfeld. I'm co-director of the Building Movement Project. And I want to start out by just giving you a little bit of information in terms of who we are as an organization. BMP is a national research organization focused on developing resources, tools to support, but also to push and challenge nonprofit organizations to be more focused on and committed to progressive social change. And so we do work in these three areas. We look at movement building, how organizations collaborate and work together to have bigger impact than they could on their own. We look at how human service organizations can integrate social change into their everyday practices, engaging with community, providing services to clients. And then we also look at leadership. What does the leadership landscape need to look like? And what are the leadership practices that we need to be developing for our organizations to be forward-looking? And so this work on race came out of a question about what basically has been getting in the way of us seeing the kind of change we've been talking about in the sector for many years. So it's not like this question about diversity, equity, and inclusion is a new one for the nonprofit sector. It's been something that's been talked about for many years, and there have been surveys documenting the lack of people of color in top-level leadership roles for many years. So we think, for instance, of Board Sources Leading with Intent survey that again came out just earlier this year. I think it was maybe the 10th time that they've done that survey. And over again, the survey results show that there are very few people of color, both in board chair positions as well as in executive leadership positions in organizations. Also, Compass Point used to do a survey on daring to lead, and they did that, I think, 3 or 4 times. And again, basically finding that there were small numbers of people of color in top-level executive positions. And so recognizing that this was not a new question, recognizing that the data had already shown that there was a problem, why was it that we were not seeing the sector move the dial? That was the central question. And so we did some background research, we interviewed people, and then we designed a survey to gather different kinds of data than had been gathered before. And so the survey was conducted online. And we, initially thought, well, let's see if we can get 2,000 people to fill out this survey, because it seemed like a good, nice round number. And then we ended up getting that within the first 4 weeks. So we then doubled our goal and got over 4,000 people working in the nonprofit sector. And then also there were some board members to complete the survey. And, mainly we got the survey out through a set of distribution partners, sort of big national organizations like the National Council of Nonprofits, Public Allies, Young Nonprofit Professionals Network, that really helped to pound the pavement and make sure that their members knew that the survey was out and encouraging people to take it. But then really what happened was word of mouth took over. And so that's sort of the great thing about a snowball sample. And so we ended up with over 4,000 respondents overall, and then 176 from the state of Massachusetts. And my co-director, Francis, will be sharing some of the sort of top line findings from the Massachusetts subsample. So in terms of who took the survey, in a way, this race breakdown looks somewhat like the United States currently. So 60% roughly of the respondents were white, and just over 40% were people of color. And then you can also see the race breakdown. And this looks, in a way like the workforce. It's certainly not like the next generation, but like the current workforce. And so we felt good about that. And so I want to start by digging into some of the data by sort of dispelling some of the ideas about what the problem might be. Because when we did the interviews before designing the survey, we asked, well, what do you think is getting in the way? What are the barriers? And we heard some of the things that you might expect, that maybe people of color don't have the training that they need to be ready to move into these roles. Maybe people of color don't aspire to move into these roles. And so I want to first just say that those actually are not the problem. So I'm going to go through some of the data that helps us dispel some of those myths. So the first thing is that people of color are largely qualified. So you see the educational breakdown looks very similar between whites and people of color. And so, I think that this idea that people of color need more education, need more training, is a myth that I think we need to start confronting. This other idea that people of color are not ready to move into those roles because of where they're situated in organizations. Now, there is an issue around fewer numbers of people of color in CEO positions, but when you collapse CEO and senior management, those two categories, when they're combined, the difference starts to disappear. Because as I think a lot of people will have seen, there are a number of people of color in this sort of second tier of organizations, and it's probably well positioned to move into the senior roles, but there's still a barrier to moving into that top role in organizations. The other thing is that people of color actually are willing. In fact, people of color were more interested in moving into CEO, senior leadership roles in the nonprofit sector than their white peers. And this is not the first survey that has found that, but when I did focus groups a year ago and I showed people these two pie charts side by side, over and over again, the assumption was that it was half of white respondents who aspired to move into senior top-level leadership roles in the sector. So we have to dispel this myth that there is a lack of aspiration on the part of people of color. So if those things are actually not the problem, what then is the problem? And what the data shows is that really we're talking about systemic and structural biases. And so when we asked people their level of agreement with some assertions about what could be behind the racial leadership gap, overwhelmingly people thought that it had to do with executive recruiters not doing enough to find a diverse pool, that it had to do with white boards, and we know that boards of directors are overwhelmingly white, that white boards don't support the leadership potential of staff of color, and then also that organizations rule out candidates of color based on perceived fit. And you can see that there are some gaps between people of color respondents and white respondents, and that gap is particularly big around this fit question. But still, over and over again, what the data shows is that people have an understanding that the barriers actually are systemic and structural. Also, when we asked people about reflecting on their own advancement, what factors had been in their favor or against them, people of color, over a third of people of color indicated their race had been a negative factor in their career advancement. And so I think we have to really reckon with this, fact that a third of people of color feel like and have experienced real barriers to access and opportunity based on race. And we gathered a number of write-in responses that really help to illustrate this. And so I'll just share one, and then Francis will share a few more as well. But this is a write-in response from a multiracial man who indicates that, the sort of standard complaints around the organizational hierarchy, right? That the people at the top tend to be white, line staff tend to be people of color. The fact that the line staff may identify with or be more similar to the constituency being served is not being seen as or recognized as an asset. And that then means that the organization sometimes just gets things wrong and is tone deaf. So it's both about the experience of people of color in these organizations when this is the structure, but also the work that the organizations end up being able to do. So I want to have Francis talk a little bit about the Massachusetts responses on some of these same themes, and then we'll continue.
Good morning. Great to be here. I hate standing behind the podium because I'm short. You see this little disembodied head, coming up, but that's the way it is today, so you'll just have to deal with that. Sometimes I have a leveler, but then if you have a dress on, you're holding the little, the mic, and anyhow, it's easier for me to do it this way. And I'm noticing how you talk. We're New Yorkers. We talk fast. We've had a lot of coffee this morning. So do you have the clicker? Or are you going to just click? Okay. So let's start with the Massachusetts data. Again, we're going to do a report later on this year and releasing early next year, but we wanted to give some top line responses. First of all, it looks very similar than the national data in terms of race, but you'll notice that there are more people who identify as African American or Black and fewer people that identify as Latino, Latina, or as we now say, Latinx. So you can look at that data and see that. I also just want to say there were 96 responses of the 176 people from the Massachusetts sample. 96 were from the greater Boston area, and there'll be a couple places I'll point out some differences between the Boston area and overall Massachusetts data, but if I don't point it out, there's not a big difference. Okay, so also I just want to say here, gender breakdown very similar, the national data and the Massachusetts data, about 78% of people who answered the survey were women, very close to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. If you look at the charitable organizations, it kind of reflects what we look like in that data. Age, very similar breakdown, about 39%, little more millennials in Massachusetts, about 39%, 38% Gen X, and the rest boomers or older. And again, similar, we're already moving out, we boomers, so it's happening, even if we didn't think it was ever going to happen. Okay, so in terms of qualifications, education, very similar. Also, you can see from the national data, almost exactly the same. If you ask people what role they're in, almost exactly the same. Salaries between people of color or whites, almost exactly the same. The only thing I'll say, if you, no, it's okay, we can move on. I always have a lot to say. Sean's kind of moving me. You can see Sean's going to move me forward. I'll sit here and chat all day long. So in terms of leadership aspirations, the difference between people of color and white respondents in Massachusetts actually was smaller. And that's because more whites aspired to leadership. So it's not that fewer people of color aspired to leadership roles, more whites aspired. I wanted to say one thing about this. There were also more people of color who said they didn't aspire at all to, or I think it's probably or definitely don't want to be a leader. And I wanted to talk about that just for 1 minute. Because if you look in Massachusetts, why people don't want to be leaders, 41% of white respondents will say it's this work-life balance, but only 19% of people of color talk about work-life balance. But 31% of people of color say they're going to leave the sector. They're going to look in another sector. Only 7% of whites said they were going to leave the sector. So that's something for people in Massachusetts to look at, because that was a very striking finding. Okay, let's move on to the systemic reasons. So again, still qualified, still aspiring people of color in Massachusetts. In terms of the systemic issues, you'll see in the top, it's a little less, this executive recruiter, they're less percentage of people who think executive recruiters are the issue than in the national data. But actually, if you look at the Boston number, that shoots up. 85% of people of color in Boston think that executive recruiters are an issue. So that's something, again, you might want to look at later on. We'll be doing this report. We might be coming back to you to ask you about that. And then this gap on organizational fit, as when Sean put in the question of organizational fit, he was really getting at this issue of implicit bias. So fit is a way to say, well, you don't quite fit our culture, which is the biases we carry in our heads. And there's a bigger gap in the Massachusetts data than there was in the national data, where more people of color feel like fit is the way that they're being filtered out of leadership positions than national data. So you see this big gap there. If you look at these factors, we asked people, what were barriers to advancement? And again, a third of the respondents in Massachusetts, almost exactly the same as the national data, said that their race was a barrier. Their track record of work, everybody thinks that works well for them. I want to say something else, though, about this. I think it's 55% here say that they think their race is an asset or helps them advance. That's very different than the national data, where only 38% felt that. And if you look at actually the greater Boston area, that shoots up to 60%. So what really has happened in Massachusetts is there are fewer people in that orange category, which is like it has no impact. So you're more bifurcated here, but you still have this very large percentage of people who say their race negatively impacts their career advancement. Now, I want to say something about that. We had all these write-in responses. Of course, when we took it to the academic researchers, they said, do not have write-in respondents. Too many people write in, and that was right. About 2,000 people wrote respondents. But that gave us this amazing data point about what people had to say. So we're going to just talk a little bit more about those responses. But first, I just want to say something. We presented this data to many different audiences. Now, this is what happens, and you can guess where it is. People's lived experience will be on the right side, and they'll be on the left side, and they'll be like, as a matter of fact, when we were in Detroit and presenting this at a community meeting, a woman got up and said, it's infuriating that we have been saying this for so many years, and we have to have the data where people are finally paying attention. On the other side are people like me who are like, wow, Sean, look what we're finding. And I just think that difference is important for us to understand, because we really approach this in a different way. It doesn't make people good or bad, but it makes it really different. This is a long-standing problem. It hasn't changed, as Sean mentioned. And if something's intractable, you have to do something different. We can't keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect it to change. But on the other hand, we did find that people of color reported real needs and support. So I want to go a little bit into that. Now we're back to the national data. We're leaving Massachusetts, going national. The first thing is we asked people who aspired to be leaders what they needed in order to take on leadership roles. And you'll see that this technical and management skills, this was a surprise, I would say, to both of us, because a lot of leadership programs are about vision, transformation, adaptation, but people actually wanted hard skills. And you'll see people of color a little bit more than whites in this. When Sean was doing focus groups, if you read the transcripts of the focus groups with people of color, what people of color say, if I don't have the credential, if I don't have the training, if I don't have that certificate, my leadership is going to be so much more carefully scrutinized than a white person's leadership. So I have to have these skills. I don't have any choice about that. So I think that the story underneath this is often not told. In terms of challenges and frustrations, we asked the respondents what their challenges and frustrations were. You can see all of us in the nonprofit sector, we feel overburdened by so much work. We hate that. But if you start going down this the other things, and you start seeing kind of pull away between people of color and white respondents, inadequate salaries, lack of relationship with funders, lack of social capital networks, not having a mentor. And then you get down to this very last category, which is being called upon to represent community. And you see this big gap between people of color and white respondents in terms of challenges and frustrations of their jobs. So I'm going to give you a couple of quotes that address this particular slide. First, on the mentorship issue, just what it feels like not to ever have a person of color as a supervisor, not to have anybody to take you under their wing as a mentee, and how that affects your leadership aspirations. As one person said when we were presenting this data, I'm tired of hitting the brick wall. So here, this is part of one of the bricks in the brick wall. The next quote I want to talk about a little bit because we heard so many people talk about this issue of representing community. So here's somebody hired in to do outreach to the Latinx community, Latino community, and then feeling not valued for all the other things that he brings to the organization. So that's one thing about representing community. We also saw from the write-in responses that there was this concern, or it wasn't a concern, an issue that happened for people of color within organizations that decide to take on race and race equity. Because then they're representing race in the organization. And not only does that make them very vulnerable within the organization, it's also very depleting, and it's work that's not recognized. It's kind of like, we're going to talk about race. Okay, you can represent the African American community. You can represent the Latino community. You take on that extra role as part of your work, and that can be extremely depleting for people. And then the last issue on representing community that came up actually in another interview study we did of 17 leaders under 40 of national organizations is that that the leaders of color told us, we know there's so few leaders of color. Funders ask us to give them advice. We're on every panel. We're on every advisory board. And we're also asked to come to community meetings. And they said to us in these interviews, these were very extensive interviews, first of all, we need to be in all those places because we need the money and we need the social capital. You saw that gap in social capital relationships with funders. They also said we want to go to the community meetings because there's so few leaders of color in the nonprofit sector. We want our communities to see us. They said, but that is an extra job that we have. And we actually have more trouble raising money. So we have less money and an extra job because we also have to run the organization. So this is an extremely important issue that I think we need to dig into more. Okay, so let's go back to Massachusetts on these same issues. I'm going to kind of go quickly through this because it's pretty much the same. You can see in the technical management skills actually more equality between people of color and white respondents, except if you look at the Boston data where 46% of people of color said they felt like they needed technical and management skills versus 27% of white, so bigger gap in the greater Boston area. If you look at their challenges and frustrations, very similar, but this organizational, representing organization, look how bigger the gap is in the Massachusetts data than it was in the national data. Again, something to look at. Okay, so let me turn it back over to Sean to talk about our LGBTQ report.
And so we shared with you 3 write-in responses. We identified those people as African American female, multiracial man, and Hispanic man. All of those write-in responses were from people who also identified as LGBT. And so I want to acknowledge that there is a particular experience around anti-LGBT bias that we also saw from a lot of the write-in responses. So 19% of the respondents self-identified as LGBT, and that was basically the same in Massachusetts. It was just 20%, but still largely the same. And still, for LGBT people of color, race is still the bigger factor. And so you can see, in fact, LGBT people of color identified race as a barrier to a larger degree than straight people of color. It was 38% compared to 33%. So there's sort of added compounded factors of marginalization that we saw play out when we looked at the data looking at particularly LGBT people of color compared to straight people of color compared to LGBT whites compared to straight whites. And so that's what this slide shows. So this frustration around being called on to represent a community, LGBT people of color, far and away, 42% are expressing that as a challenge or frustration. Straight people of color, it's less. LGBT whites, it's less. And then straight whites, it's less. And that pattern repeated for all of these challenges and frustrations. Maybe not as dramatically for some of the other factors, but still it was surprisingly consistent. And so we just wanted to acknowledge that was an additional factor. And we gathered a lot of write-in responses about the lack of safety that people felt being out in nonprofit organizations, particularly LGBT folks working in more politically conservative, religiously conservative parts of the country. And so, one way that people indicated that they were able to find safety was by working for identity-based organizations. And so it was really interesting, and it's explored much more in depth in the report. But people of color are much more likely to report working for an identity-based organization. So immigrant rights organizations, civil rights organizations, feminist organizations, LGBT organizations. And then LGBT people of color even more so. And we also know that those are the organizations that often have the hardest time raising money. They're the organizations with the smallest budgets, all of those things. So people are making choices to work in community organizations that generally do not get the same level of investment as some of their peer organizations. So the question we're left with is, what do we do? So again, just want to remind folks of what the issue is. So nonprofit CEOs don't reflect the community that's being served by organizations. And then a third of people of color feel that their race has negatively impacted their advancement in the nonprofit sector. And then on top of it, everybody recognizes this is a problem. So the question then is, what are we going to do about it? So I think the first thing is we have to start addressing bias and racism, because bad experiences really can undermine people's aspiration and willingness to stay in the sector. But the way we address bias and racism isn't by just adding to the second job that people of color already have in their organizations. We also have to shift the focus from sort of addressing fictional gaps on the part of people of color to start addressing the culture around current leaders. And so, that means that we're going to have to contest with power and make sure that we're paying attention to board composition, having difficult conversations with board members and current executives. The work of changing the culture is going to be slow and hard, but it's going to be necessary if we're going to have lasting change and real opportunity start to expand. And we then should also be measuring change. We're sort of pushed to be rigorous about all kinds of other data that we're collecting, but the question becomes, well, what happens to the other data that sort of gets submitted to foundations about the racial composition of our organizations or our boards? Are decisions actually being made based on that information, or is it just being collected and warehoused? That also, though, means that we should be honoring small wins. So it doesn't mean that a board composition has to change entirely within a 5-year period, but maybe a win is actually getting a board member to have a difficult conversation and recognize some of the biases that they held that prevented them from investing in the leadership development of someone on staff. I want to also mention that we have a research agenda, a very ambitious research agenda for the next few years, because there's so much data to dig into. Over 4,000 respondents, there's a lot of ways that we can slice and dice the data. So we really want to look at the current CEOs that took the survey and see, are there differences between people of color and white CEOs in terms of their path to leadership roles, the kinds of organizations that they're leading, what they're experiencing. We also want to look at the intersection of gender and race in the same way that we looked at the intersection of LGBT identity and race. We're interested in doing deep dives in specific places, and so this Massachusetts report that will be coming out next year is one of those examples. And then we want to resurvey in 2019. So if you're just hearing about the survey now and you didn't take the survey last year, hopefully when the survey comes out in 2019, you'll know about it and you'll participate and encourage other people to do the same. So thank you all very much. Feel free to, again, download the report, and also don't hesitate to reach out to Francis or I if you have any questions. I'm going to turn it over.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So happy to see so many people in the room for such important conversation. I'm Jennifer Aronson. I'm Associate Vice President for Programs here at the Foundation. And as part of my role here, as Orlando mentioned, I oversee our nonprofit effectiveness work, which is focused on supporting and strengthening effective, sustainable, and inclusive nonprofit organizations. And we recently included inclusive as part of what it takes to make a nonprofit organization effective. And there are really 3 reasons for that. The first is the data, as Orlando mentioned, and as we've seen, diverse teams lead to better decisions and more innovative decisions. The second reason is in support of the Boston Foundation's value statement, which reads, "In everything we do, we seek to broaden participation, foster collaboration, and heal racial, ethnic, and community divisions." And the third reason is because of you. About a year ago, we held focus groups with over 30 nonprofit sector leaders, many of you in the room today. And we asked you how you're thinking about this unprecedented shift in leaders from across the nonprofit sector, some moving within the sector, some retiring, in part driven by demographics, in part driven by burnout. How are you thinking about it? And what we heard was really clear. Much more than the need for support and to think about succession planning, much more than the opportunity to think about restructuring or collaborating or merging, we heard that the time, the urgency to seize this moment right now in order to ensure that the demographics of the leaders that are leading these organizations will reflect not just the communities that we're serving and partnering with, but the general population of our country, and what it looks like now and what it will continue to look like. The other thing that we heard was that the Boston Foundation has a leadership role to play. You said, you turned it back on us, to me, and said, well, what are you guys going to do about it? You have this big platform, and we need your leadership. And so, given that this morning's forum is a direct result of those conversations, and in recognition of the power and the leadership in this room, before I invite up our esteemed panel, who we are very much looking forward to hearing from, I'd like to invite you all to take the next 10 minutes to turn to one another. Maybe it's someone you came with, maybe it's someone that you didn't come with, and discuss and process what you just heard. Francis and Sean gave us a lot to think about, a lot of confirming information, a lot of, oh, I didn't realize that, depending on where you sit. And I think it would be really powerful for you guys to do that, translate these numbers into the change that we all want to see in Greater Boston, and in exactly 10 minutes, we will have the panel discussion start. So thank you. Hi, folks. I'm sorry to break up the conversation. Hi. Yeah, why don't you guys come on up? It's clear that there's a lot of energy in the room around this issue. And we hope these conversations will continue and will lead to other conversations and more importantly, to action outside of this room. So a quick note on framing before we dive in and I introduce our panelists. Today we're looking to focus the discussion on the successes and the challenges facing nonprofit staff. However, we do recognize that boards play an important role, a very important role, in driving staff diversity, equity, and inclusion. And to this end, we'll be hosting an event in early 2018 to examine and understand the role of boards in this work. So in addition to, we hope, coming back in 2018 to dig deeper into building movement projects, Massachusetts Race to Lead data, we also hope to come back in another conversation to discuss the role of boards. So with that said, it is my pleasure to welcome our esteemed panel, Trina Jackson, Community Engagement Practice Leader from TS&E Mission Works, Deborah Ray, President and CEO of the Big Sister Association of Greater Boston, Danny Rojas, Director of Post-Secondary Partnerships from One Goal, and Shahir Mustafa, President and CEO of Hopewell, formerly DARE Family Services. Their impressive bios are summarized in the handouts that you received on your seats. And because we're anxious to get to the conversation, I will not go over them, but I encourage you to read through them. So let's dig in. Trina, I'm going to start with you. Part of your work at TS&E Mission Works has been overseeing the Inclusion Initiative, a program that provides support and technical assistance to help organizations work together to address the causes of poverty and inequality. In this role, you've worked closely with a wide range of organizations of different sizes. So my question is, what are some of the structural barriers to diversity and inclusion that you see most often in your work? And is there anything to be learned by comparing and contrasting some of these smaller, scrappier organizations with larger, more traditionally structured and funded organizations?
Well, thanks for the question, Jennifer, and good morning to everyone. I see a lot of my mentors, people who have shaped me in this audience, so it's an honor to be here and be part of this conversation. So, I guess I'll start, well, we've already sort of talked about, the biggest structural barrier that we're all aware of, which is structural racism. And I've seen that, across more traditional organizations sort of dealing with this issue. But there are a couple of things I'd like to say about that. The first thing is I think that we are still attached to old notions of leadership. And look for those kind of criteria even when we're dealing with people of color. And so, leadership that is, white, male, educated, that looks a particular way. We're looking for, different types of behavior, certain types of behaviors. And those traditional forms of leadership we're still pretty much attached to. The other part of that is that our work around diversity and inclusion is more about diversity than inclusion, which is to say that we're still more concerned with representation than actual leadership when it comes to people of color. And so I think that that's also a particular structural barrier. At the Inclusion Initiative at TS&E Mission Works, our work is to fund leadership of people of color working in the community that are directly impacted. And I think that's the opportunity that we have. We are very heartened by the results that we've seen when we invest in people who are living the issues, who are tied to community, not necessarily working in traditional organizations, but your more grassroots organizations that are connected to the people that are dealing with the issue. And we've seen really powerful results when people are bringing to the table their own expertise, the solutions that they think need investment, and that are in charge of what the intervention and the work looks like. So I think that those are structural lessons that traditional organizations can learn from our scrappier, more grassroots organizations.
Awesome. Thank you. Deb, the report highlights the importance of identifying and measuring results. At Big Sisters, under your leadership, the organization has achieved an increase from 17% people of color on staff to 40%. Can you describe what went into these changes at Big Sisters? And if you can, touch on Trina's point of inclusion, not just diversity.
I will do that. Thanks, Jennifer, for having me here. I think this is a critically important issue, and especially as a white woman leading an organization that is serving predominantly girls of color, it is really critical that to have the voice here and to talk about this issue. So the numbers do represent just the diversity and not the inclusion. So I'll tell you what we've done for the numbers, and then I can tell you also what we've done to create change. So the numbers, we always thought of ourselves as being valuing diversity and inclusion. You know, in 2007, we created this diversity council, and we said, and this was a group of mostly Big Sisters, but strong, talented women that came from the community to really help us shift the number of Big Sisters of color, because the majority of the girls that we serve are girls of color, yet those mentors, it was only like 20% that were women of color. So that was their focus, and that's what they moved the needle from. It was like 20%, now we're at 33%. We were feeling really good about that. But then we took a look internally, and we looked at our staff, and we said 17% of staff that are working with this population, that we have work to do here, so what are we going to do? Well, the people that we hired were MSWs. So we were going to the schools of social work saying that we needed more women of color in these positions. And they were saying to us, we don't have the students, that we don't have those numbers that you're looking for. So we said, do we really need MSWs for these positions? So we changed the job, and we opened up the possibility for more people to apply. So now you don't have to have an MSW to be a match support specialist or to be an enrollment and match support person working with this population. So that was part of it. We also took the strategies of the Diversity Council, and they were out there in the community recruiting women. Well, now they're recruiting people to be staff. Now we're looking at the partnerships and leveraging the partnerships we have with the community, with the City of Boston, with Boston Housing, with every entity, agency in this city to say, now we are looking to change Big Sister internally in our staff. We started looking at the language. What are we saying on our website? It's EEOC. Are we really saying what we want? So we were very explicit in saying we encourage people of color to apply. We looked internally at the questions that we're asking, the hiring questions, and are we really asking people who are applying for these jobs about their cultural competency? What do they know about the City of Boston? What do they know about the history? We changed the new employee orientation that we do, that I do, and it could be because I'm from the city that they asked me to do this training, but I do the training, and it's on the history of racism in the city. It's on Boston Public Schools. It's on busing. I want people to know who Willie Horton is, who Mel King is, so they have to understand that to be a part of the organization. We have done a lot more on inclusion, because that is only the first step, is to get people into Big Sister. But then it's about the retention of that staff so that they want to stay, so it's a place that they want to work. So we've looked at the holidays. We've looked at, are we tone deaf about some of these issues? Are we actually celebrating the holidays? We have, Columbus Day is a floating holiday. We had to look at what we were, even on our screens in the reception area, when people come to the organization. What are the images that we're projecting? Who are we? So it's the inclusion part was a real shift in the way we work within that I can talk about later.
That's great. Thank you. I will come back to you for that. Danny, one of the report's main recommendations is for organizations to implement race-conscious practices that address issues of implicit bias. One goal is a national organization based in Chicago with an incredibly strong commitment to DEI. Can you discuss what this means locally in the Massachusetts chapter and also your role leading this effort?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I deeply believe that you cannot implement race-based, race-conscious practices and address the issues of implicit bias without a deep commitment from the national leadership, from senior level leadership. And so at OneGo, we've been fortunate enough to have a CEO and a board, a national board that's deeply committed to this work and actually has led a lot of the charge in our journey to being a more anti-racist organization. I think one of my roles, one of the things that they did before going into phase 3 of expansion of our nonprofit was assemble an aspirational diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. I'm on that committee, and it is comprised of individuals from all levels of the organizations, from the coordinator program all the way to the president of our organization. And one of our first charges was to listen to the people that work at OneGo. What are they saying about where do we want to be as an organization as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion? What will that look like? What will it feel like? And one of the first things that we did at our national all-staff retreat was the people in the committee facilitated an exercise called the Back to the Future Protocol. Many of you may have heard of this. And it's essentially, we split into smaller groups. And we talked about what would it look like, feel like, sound like to be an organization that is deeply committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we just allowed the people in the room to speak, and we recorded everything. And we made pretend that we were in present time. So make pretend that you're actually living in, working in this organization. What does that sound like? What does it look like? And the second stage was thinking about the past, which is actually the current. So what were your experiences in the past in the organization? What were the real lived experiences? What did you go through? What did you experience? What did you hear that didn't feel right, that didn't sit right with you? And then the last part of it, which I thought was really cool, was what did it take to get there? So people really articulated some of the things that they would do in order to reach that space where diversity, equity, and inclusion was actually lived out in the organization. So that was something that I thought was really important and helped really set a clear vision before we can even get to some of these race conscious practices.
Great, thank you. And Shahir, like Deb, you've had some real success diversifying your staff, and currently over half of Hopewell's staff and 80% of the executive management team identifies people of color. Similarly, in your prior role at DCF, you were focused on staff diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Can you talk about your approach to this work at both organizations?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So thank you and good morning, everybody. I think it's really important that we just take a step back and get grounded in why we're having this conversation in the first place. So oftentimes in my experience, these dialogues begin and end with respect to the moral imperative for why diversity is important, right? That it's the right thing to do. And I'd like to think that I'm preaching to the converted here and saying that I believe that it is the right thing to do. But the conversation cannot end there. And I think the difference between organizations that are effective at implementing DEI practices and those that are not are those that can effectively articulate a business case for diversity. So we've touched on that a little bit in some of the comments, but ultimately in the sector, we are solving complex problems. And there's tremendous data to support that diversity in problem-solving groups consistently outperforms homogenous groups, right? Because homogenous groups tend to get stuck, and diverse problem-solving groups are able to create innovative practices and breakthroughs, right? Because of the different approaches that they're bringing to the table. So whether it's, resolving community violence or limiting disproportionality in the foster care system or degradation of the environment, it's key to our organization's missions that we bring together diverse groups of problem solvers to tackle these issues, right? So that's one piece. Another piece is that attracting and retaining top talent is critically important. And so we're in the business of people in the organizations in the nonprofit sector, and we're all vying for top talent to solve these complex problems. So organizations that are effective in this work are going to be able to attract, recruit, and retain the top level talent in the sector. So from a business perspective, not just because it's the right thing to do, but from a business perspective, it makes a lot of sense to pay attention to this. And the last thing that I just want to comment with respect to approach is, talk is cheap. Values are not enough. It's a good place to start, but at the end of the day, we are judged based on our behavior. And so having an integrated DEI plan that is smart, right? Specific, measurable, achievable. You guys know the deal. And it can't just be about representative diversity. So again, that's symbolic, it's meaningful, and it's important. But I think tying DEI goals to a mission imperative is critically important. So for us at Hopewell, we spend a lot of time working with youth in foster care. So a goal for us is to reduce the number of Black and brown youth that are disproportionately represented in the foster care system. So that's a DEI goal that is clearly tied to mission. So it's when those things that become aligned, that's to me, in my experience, what the differentiator is between organizations that are effective in this space and organizations that are not.
Great, thank you. Deb, I'm going to come back to you as promised. We're all familiar with the complaint from hiring organizations, and we've heard about it today from Sean and Francis, that good qualified candidates of color are hard to find. But the report data that Francis and Sean shared with us shows that people of color and white respondents are essentially equivalent in terms of their background, qualification, skills, preparation. You just gave us an example of where you can't find an equivalency with education, with the MSW example. You've changed the job. So I have a two-part question for you. One is, and to the any sort of skeptics in the audience or that we might encounter beyond this room, can you talk about the quality of the work that is done? Have you found that you've had to in any way compromise the quality? Because obviously Big Sister's mission is to support the little sisters and to create community change in that way. And then the second part of my question is about, as you started to discuss, the systemic change. The numbers are great, but as I was having a pre-conversation with you and sort of celebrating those numbers, you were very quick to say, but it's not about the numbers, it's about systemic change, it's about inclusion, it's about combating this notion that, yes, we onboard for diversity, to Trina's point, but we hire for diversity, but we end up onboarding for assimilation. So throwing a lot at you, but would love your responses and also those from anyone else on the panel.
Yeah. So first about the quality issue, I think it enhances the quality when you have an understanding between that match support specialist working with that family, supporting that little sister. So, it absolutely enhanced it. I think it increases our length of match. I can't prove that, but I believe that, okay, because our length of match has increased, and we have increased our diversity. So I'll say there's a definite causation there, correlation. And that, so a lot to say here. Okay, so I just want to say this. As a white person leading an organization, for all whites leading a nonprofit organization, you have to be vulnerable. You absolutely have to engage in this difficult work and be open to failing, to making mistakes, and then to moving on, to be really in it and of it. And I'll say that, what inclusion, you can't do something for somebody without them because you're doing it to them, and they're not gonna feel engaged in it. And it's so clear. It is, so you've got to really believe in it. I mean it. And you talk about fit, right? We talked about the fact in that report that people, they use the word fit, doesn't fit the culture. The culture has to change, and that is the essence of all this work that we're doing at Big Sister. We are changing the culture, and it is hard, and we're immersed in it, and we want to be, and we need to be, because then the diversity of those numbers, bringing people in, if you don't have that retention, what do you have, and why are you doing it anyway? So then I'll just talk about a little bit what we've done. About the values, I do think you have to declare them though. And so we did bring staff together and we said, what are our values now as an organization? So we did come up and collectively with the courageous communication, what that means. What does community mean? What does cultural responsiveness mean? What does equity mean for Big Sister? In that we had to define it. This was difficult. You're working with a staff of 50 and you've got a lot of different ideas to try to wordsmith, try to get it, to get the essence. And we said, okay, we're going with it. We're going to put it on the website. And you know what? They can change, and we can work on that. So we did start with that. every meeting at Big Sister, every meeting starts with a conversation about racial equity, about inclusion, about diversity. Senior management team meetings every week, that is what we start with. And we're talking about what's happening nationally, what's happening locally, and what's happening internally at Big Sister. Why do we do that? Because we want people to talk about their experience. Also from that, we decide we're going to write an op-ed, we're going to write a letter to the editor, we're going to be out there, we're going to publicly declare how we stand on these issues, and that is really important, so that the words become actions, really critical. And every meeting starts that way. Every department meeting starts with talking about that. All right, so the other thing is the trainings. Senior team members must go to trainings, as do managers, as we, frontline staff, service staff, all of us are going through trainings and then sharing what we've learned. We have People of Color Affinity Group. They meet whenever they want. They at least meet monthly. They meet with me quarterly. They check in. They want to talk about certain things that happen. I'm open to that. We have those conversations. They're difficult. I also have chat and chills every month for all direct service staff. And again, during those conversations, we're learning and growing together, and it's real. It's real conversation. I already talked about the holidays. We're not going to be tone deaf. We're going to be dealing with issues. A lot of things have happened. Examples where I can tell you that, truth to power. When a direct service person can go to a senior level team member and say, that picture that you shared when you were a kid, and you have feathers, and it says little running nose, and I'm a Native American, grew up on Pine Ridge, that's offensive, but that she can have that discussion, and that senior team member can say, thank you, I learned from that. That's when I know that change is happening at Big Sister. And then I'm going to end with this, because I could continue, obviously, talk a lot about it, but let's face it, over 75% of the people that work at nonprofits are women. Do women get paid as social work, teachers, nurses? All those professions that are predominantly women are not getting paid. So what did we do this year? We increased direct service staff pay by $2,000. Everybody got a $2,000 a year increase. Not only did we do that, we have an incentive bonus. If you're at Big Sister for 2 years, you're getting $500. If you're there 3 years, you're getting $1,500. If you're there, and it goes on, right? Because again, actions speak louder. That pay is important. This is economics. Can you live in Boston on a nonprofit salary? No. You're living with like 5 people in an apartment. So it's not right. And plus, we are an organization focused on girls, right? What do we want for those little sisters? As we started coming up with new innovative programming and saying we want a sustainable living wage for these little sisters, and then we have staff that don't have a sustainable living wage, well then really we're not mirroring what we want for our little sisters. So I'll end on that, but it's important.
Yeah, Trina, please.
Jump in. I appreciate what Deborah is raising. I think another dynamic around this whole thread is that our nonprofits have become very over-professionalized in the last 50, 60, I don't know how many years. There was a time when nonprofits were really about change, and people that were dealing with the issues were running the organizations. And so, as and that's shifted the structure of nonprofits, even the structure of social change work, assuming that is the reason that we have our nonprofit organizations, is because we're trying to affect change and affect these larger social inequities. And our sector has become so professionalized that you've got, organizers, with master's degrees and bachelor's degrees. Now that in and of itself, inherently, isn't the issue, but what does it do to people's connection to the actual issues that we're trying to affect? And it may create a disconnect between the organization and the work that needs to be done on the ground. So I think that's also a dynamic that we're dealing with, and that our nonprofit, we have a nonprofit industry that is more sort of focused on sustaining an industry in so many ways, not every way, but many ways, and less on the impact that we're trying to make in these social issues. So I feel like it's an opportunity for us to address that shift in our sector.
Yep. Thank you for that, especially as the person that oversees our nonprofit effectiveness strategy. I am absorbing that. So I also just want to, I forgot to mention that we will move to Q&A in about 10 minutes. But in the meantime, if you have questions, so that you don't forget them, you can tweet at us at #race2lead, and we will also be taking them from Twitter. So I'm going to turn to Danny and Shahir, both of you. In your leadership in your organizations are very intentional about ensuring that you're thinking about DEI not only in the hiring, but also in the onboarding and supporting staff when they arrive. You both shared with me some really great strategies and practices that you practice in your organization. So I'm sorry, I lost my place. So I'm contrasting that with what the report finds, which is that while the majority of aspiring leaders feel prepared to take on an executive role and have skills similar to their white peers, that people of color respondents reported wanting more technical and management skills more often than white respondents. So I was hoping that you could each share a bit about your respective organizations and your approaches to that balance with providing the technical skills and support, as well as respecting the leadership and the lived experience of those that come into the organizations.
Yeah, and also as it relates to retaining.
Yes,
yeah,
please.
Talent. A few things. One of the things that we do before we engage in the hiring process is there's clarity around the knowledge, skills, and mindsets that it will take to be successful in that given role. Our application process is pretty lengthy, but it's because the decision is not made in a vacuum. There's very genuine input from everybody on the team before that person gets hired. And we have very real discussions around the skills and the things that it will take to be successful in that role. One thing that I really appreciate is the onboarding process. We have a co-pilot model, so everybody that gets hired receives a co-pilot, which is a mentor within the organization that will help them be successful in that role. And you connect on a regular basis. And you keep that co-pilot for the duration of your time working in the organization. And that's been a pretty powerful way for me to feel successful, for me to learn from people that have been in the organization longer than I have. And then also the way that our onboarding is structured is we get to interact with people across the nation within our roles, senior level leadership. We have ongoing onboarding via our Zoom network. We do have affinity groups, so we have a men of color group, we have a Christian group, we have a white allies group. So there's different groups that, as Deb said, that meet on a regular basis to talk about very real issues that are affecting them within the organization. But I think the thing that I want to highlight is the org-wide commitment to diversity from the high level senior leadership, and I can best illustrate that through a story. When it was during the time of the election, and to be clear, one goal is does not take sides in any political stances, but one thing that happened, the senior leadership team was meeting in the Boston office. So the CEO and all of the senior leaderships, all of the executive directors across the nation were meeting in Boston on the day after the election, and they were scheduled to have a 6-hour meeting in our office. I went into work. Feeling however I was feeling, and really prepared because of my previous work experiences. Those kind of things you just kind of keep to yourself, right? You just kind of live through it, work through the day, push through. So I was very, very prepared to kind of push through the day, serve my students, not think about whatever was happening. And as all the senior leadership were coming into the room, they went into the room, they closed the door, and then the executive director opened the door back up and invited the entire office into their room. And I kid you not, we took 2 hours of their leadership time just to talk about how people were feeling and recognizing the very real experiences that people were feeling in reaction to some of the things that were said about certain people throughout the election. And it was less about like, what side you picked, and it was more about the human aspect of realizing this is something that is going to impact not only some people in our organization, but also our fellows, the fellows that we work with day in and day out, and acknowledging that you need to be in the proper space to do this work. I thought that was a very genuine illustration of an organization embracing diversity from the leadership team. They did not have to take two hours of their day, but that's something that just came organically as a result of who they are and how they approach DEI work.
Thank you. She here?
Yeah, I'd like to focus a little bit on retention if I can, and I think, Deborah, you mentioned that, why I think it's important to focus on retention is that you got to start with where you are. And so if you don't have good practices in place to build retention, then when you onboard new folks, it's just going to be like a sieve, right? So you got to make sure that you support the people that are currently in your organization. And I want to just highlight something that's been a piece of my experience is that oftentimes I've seen people of color become tokenized in leadership positions. And that's really unfortunate for a number of different reasons. And I think what happens is they fail to receive the support that they need to be successful in their role. So again, kind of just putting somebody into the role, but then not supporting them and giving them all the other pieces that they need to be successful is actually, it can do more harm than never putting them in that position in the first place, frankly. And so I've had the experience, kind of the inverse experience to that I'd like to share, kind of a positive experience, and I'll just use myself as an example. So I think my path, my arc and trajectory into leadership is probably not too different from a lot of people in the nonprofit sector. So I'm trained as a therapist, and I was good at providing therapy. I was pretty good at it. So, people said, well, you should supervise other people who do therapy, and then you should run a program of people who do therapy, right? But the requisite skills required to lead a program versus being a good technician are very different. And I think oftentimes organizations fail to highlight that delta in the skill gap. But the organization I was a part of had the foresight to enroll myself and a number of other folks in a formalized certified professional development program, which I think was critically important for me because, like a lot of folks too, I didn't know what I didn't know. So I saw people leading and I was like, oh, I can do that. I can totally do that, no problem. But then I got a balance sheet and I didn't know how to read it. Or didn't know how to develop a fundraising strategy, or I didn't know best practices for moving through progressive discipline and human resources. So the technical skills that a leader is called to utilize is critically important. I think, you talked about affinity groups and mentoring and coaching, and all of that is important, as are professional development programs, in my opinion. And the last thing that I would just say about this is a lot of my peers that are in leadership positions, I talk to them about kind of these types of programs and supports for their staff, and there's like a reluctance. There's a reluctance to invest in their people because, well, what if they leave? And I have limited resources, and so, do I want to spend this kind of money and support on somebody, and then what if they go? And I just look at it a little bit differently. I think in our sector, even if you have a tremendous succession plan, a tremendous succession strategy, inevitably there's going to be turnover in your organization. And I think we should not run away from turnover. I think we need to look at that and embrace it. If it's a dysfunctional level of turnover, obviously that's a problem, but there's a healthy degree of turnover we should expect and anticipate. And the reality is, if I invest in somebody and there's no space for them at Hopewell to kind of grow and progress, maybe they go to Big Sisters, maybe they go to Third Sector or TBF or somewhere else within the sector and serve their community in a different way. So I don't look at it as a loss to us. I just look at it as, we are growing and developing our sector.
Great. I think there are a record number of applause from panel comments, which is amazing. Just a couple more questions before we open it up to the audience. Trina, just a question for you and also the panel, if you want to jump in, about fundraising. I was struck by the Race to Lead report's finding that people of color are less likely than whites to identify as a good fundraiser, and that people of color were more likely to agree that people of color-led organizations have a harder time fundraising. So I'm wondering if this is consistent with what you see in your consulting work, and why you think this is, and what the opportunity is.
Yeah, I thank you for the question. It definitely is consistent with what I've seen and what we all see. I think that my thoughts about this is, the larger wealth inequality that is, in our society, in our country. And I think that this challenge, this struggle fits within that. Because so much about fundraising is about, personal connections and moving in particular circles and engaging with people in a particular way. And so for people of color, we are, if we're not really coming, if we don't have access to networks or networks where there's a lot of wealth, that has an impact on how we're able to look to our own networks for that kind of financial support. And I'm separating in this conversation fundraising from grant writing. But fundraising is much more about networks and connections and these circles. You're talking to people, you're interacting, you're networking, you're having a conversation about where you went to school, where you went on vacation, what kind of food you eat, where you live. We know there is segregation, racialized segregation across all of those areas. And so if that's the main way that we do fundraising, then people of color are absolutely facing a barrier. We might internalize that as lacking skill. That's how we've internalized the structural racism, that there's something about who we are or a skill that we don't have. It's, it goes back, it's a structural issue. We don't have, in the same numbers and at the same levels, access to those networks. So that's one thing. The other thing is a lesson that we learned at TS&E Mission Works. We did an urgent response fund to support grassroots organizations that were feeling very impacted by the results of the election. And same with you, we try to be nonpartisan, be respectful of other people's, how people vote and stuff like that. And that's important, that's part of a functioning democracy. Okay, cool. Because of our mission and because of the program that I'm managing, we felt like it was really important. What can we do in this moment as grant makers in order to support people to deal with this changed reality? And what we learned from so we gave out small grants to organizations that wanted to do something on the ground immediate. Get their folks together, get their people together, do a training, do a Know Your Rights training, learn more about the ban and the impact of the travel bans that were coming out of the administration. And so we got a lot of applications. We gave away about $30,000 just in small grants. We got a lot of applications, and a lot of the applications that we got were written by the EDs. These were primarily small grassroots organizations led by people of color. The EDs are writing the grants. They're also the ones that are doing the crisis intervention. They're also the ones that are doing everything else. So that's the other thing, is that people of color in organizations, and like we've already heard, are doing multiple things and didn't have really grant writers or fundraisers necessarily on staff. So that's yet another structural barrier that as people of color we're faced with. That definitely manifests within large traditional organizations and in grassroots organizations as well. So I think if we can see the challenge as part of the larger structure of economic inequality and wealth disparities, I just think it fits within that.
Thank you. Okay, this is my last question, and I'm posing it to Shahir and Deb based on our pre-conversations, but please, Danny and Trina, feel free to jump in. So we've been talking a lot about the specific, measurable steps that organizations can take to make progress, but I don't feel like I can go to Q&A without acknowledging the deeply personal and often painful nature of the work, and more so how we got to this situation to begin with. And so to the extent you're comfortable, I'd love for both of you just to share a bit about your personal journey, your origin story, how your identity and personal experience inform the work that you're leading and that you do.
Okay, so it is definitely a personal journey. I don't think you can separate it and say because I'm leading Big Sister and there are girls of color that we're serving that, you can just start doing this work. You begin within. It's who you are as a human being. And growing up in Boston, it's been my sort of life's work because I grew up in the neighborhood of Rosendale. My father's from Roxbury, my mother's from Dorchester. We stayed in the city. I still live in the city. And I have a personal investment in making change. And it's, you know, it's my family too. So it is who I am and what I believe we need to do. And so it is personal. You just can't separate it. And as I said before, I do think you have to embrace vulnerability, that as much as I may, you know, want this, that doesn't mean that I have what it takes to get there. And I don't think there's a finish line to it. I think you evolve as a person, you evolve the organization. So the more honest and open I can be, transparent about who I am, allow myself to fall, make mistakes, and get up and admit them and say, okay, I'm back in the game here. And I've made a fair number of errors at Big Sister. I will share one quick one with you. I send out an email every week to my staff, and this particular week, I sent out a link to Vanity Fair with Caitlyn Jenner on the cover. And I made a comment about the sexualization of Caitlyn Jenner, that she was sexualized, and there was a link to the article as well. And one of my staff members wrote me an email and said, I don't agree with you, and you're basically, I was wrong, that you're making a comment about how she decided to look on the cover of Vanity Fair, that you were, you know, criticizing her look. So we met, and I said, you know, Mom, I don't agree. That's not what my intent was. My intent was just to say that I felt like she was now doing what all women that feel like we get, you know, sexualized into this look, and we disagreed. And then I learned about intent and impact, right? So that was my journey. And somebody, you know, wise person, because I kept telling the story because I thought I was right, but I knew there was something wrong. But I knew there was something not, you know, and I didn't like the fact that that staff member and I didn't close on that we disagreed and kept going. And so the wise person said to me, Deb, did you ever have a guy say something to you that you were offended by, something about the way women look or the way they act, blah, blah, you know, given the work that I do? And I said, yeah, oh, absolutely. You know, they said, oh, it's just a joke, you're just being too sensitive. And then, how did you feel? And I said it, and they go, so the intent and impact was different, wasn't it? The impact for you was really, it insulted you, it offended you. But that, he said, it wasn't his intent. So I learned from that, and I did talk to the staff member after. I apologized. She was surprised when I called her into my office, and I said, I'm sorry, but it's learning, and you have to put yourself out there as a leader and say, you're in it. So, yeah,
Thank you.
it's my personal journey.
Yeah, I'd echo a lot of what you just shared. So first of all, like I identify as mixed race or biracial. So my mom and my maternal side of the family immigrated from Poland and Quebec to the North Shore and settled in Salem. And my father immigrated from Pakistan. He was a refugee following partition, which I actually just learned not too long ago, and went to medical school and then came to the United States as a surgeon. And so being biracial and bicultural, I feel like obviously has shaped like my entire identity, but certainly with respect to this conversation around race. I'm smirking because I'm like, I'm a bit of a race chameleon. So wherever I go, I kind of get adopted by that community. So, like when I go to, Hyde Park with my kids to get our hair cut every other Sunday morning, I'm Dominican or I'm Puerto Rican. And when I go to Somerville or Framingham, I'm spoken to in in Portuguese because I'm Brazilian. And then when people read my name, it's obvious that I'm Egyptian. So, but it's actually, I chuckle at it because, the benefit for me, frankly, is I feel like I've had access to communities and conversations that many of my white peers just simply don't. And I think that has humanized people's experiences for me in a way that has really helped me to be humble, to understand, that this is really difficult and hard for people. And then I was raised by my white family, and they treated me great. But I never quite felt like I didn't look like them. I didn't quite feel like I belonged in that community either. So it's helped me to develop like patience and understanding around kind of the complexity of these dynamics. And then the other piece too that I think we have to acknowledge is, I was raised with privilege, significant financial privilege. And had that not been my experience, I know that my experience would have been different. At the end of the day, identity is really, really complicated. And I think, we have to try to approach this from a place of seeking greater understanding and just bringing patience and humility to the process.
Thank you. Danny or Trina, do you guys want to jump in before I open it up? No need to. I just want to create space.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I'm anxious for the large
Okay.
conversation.
Danny, yeah? Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Wow. So we have 25 minutes left together, so we will try to get to as many questions as we can. You can wait for someone, please, with a microphone to come to you. Because we are live streaming this, or you can tweet at us, #race to lead with your questions. Please be sure to ask a question and not make a statement. And because there's so many people who want to participate, please keep your questions brief. Okay. So there's one right here. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Aisha Upchurch, and I'm with VSA Massachusetts. And thank you all for being a super dope, awesome, just fantabulistic panel and being so straightforward with language. And I wanted to ask a question in reference to a comment that you made, Trina, around us needing to shift away from this paradigm of leadership that's been coded and framed by the white male normative. Because that's a question I wondered when you all were reading the results of the report, like, but did we ask what leadership could look like and mean? So I'm wondering for you or for any of the panelists, if you could explain or help us envision what leadership, not framed by this very Eurocentric male perspective, could and should, I said, look like.
Yeah, thank you. Do you want to take one question at a time?
Yeah,
or
let's
you
do one
wanna-
at a time.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think it's a really critical question as we try to think about what are the alternatives or what are the opportunities. I think that for many people of color, we think of leadership as sort of more collective. Where you're drawing from, you're identifying with the larger group beyond just the self. And I think traditional notions of leadership is that you've got one leader who is, charismatic, but is the voice of the organization, the voice of the work. That person is sort of held up as kind of sort of like the model as an individual for, what leadership looks like. And this model of leadership is not only, within nonprofits, but around social issues, around social movements. And so I think that a model of leadership that looks a lot more collective, much more collaborative, that isn't always about being out front and being the expert all the time, but is about sharing knowledge, harvesting knowledge from lots of different perspectives, that's more sort of relationship-centered. I think that that type of leadership needs to be more valued in organizations. Not fancy language, people talking, in the way that they express themselves, like the way that I'm doing right now, using my hands, being very demonstrative and descriptive. That makes people uncomfortable in a lot of our boardrooms and our staff meetings.
And I think additionally, it looks like genuinely listening to the people that we serve and
That's
not making
right.
decisions for them without them.
That's right.
And I think that that's
Absolutely.
something that our executive director and even our leadership takes very seriously. Like our policy is like if we can't say something in front of our students, then we shouldn't be saying it.
Absolutely.
And so this summer
That's
we
right.
really we had 2 interns in our office, and literally they were part of our team meetings. We gave them a voice, we gave them input. They have something to say, and if we are actually genuinely serving them, why are they not part of the decision-making process?
Yeah.
Why do we keep not involving their parents? Like that needs to be at the heart of how we approach this work with them at every level and every step of the way.
Yeah. Thank you.
Tammy, on the other side of the pole.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for, as you said here, a super dope panel. It was amazing. Thank you. I had a question for you all. And first, I have to give a shout out to Ms. Trina. I chair the board of TS&E Mission Works and just really proud of her work. So thank you all for having her. I wanted to ask this question about professional development. So Shahira, you actually mentioned it very specifically about the ways in which you were trained and allowed for professional development opportunities. We've talked about this before. It's one of the first things to go in budgets. It's one of those things that we don't give a lot of credence to, and we don't respect it in that really training any leader, but specifically leaders of color. And so I wonder if any of you could speak to the ways in which you specifically have designed at the staff level to provide really professional development, again, that doesn't just check a box, but really enhances the ability for staff members to be able to move up. And appreciate your point about sometimes they're moving to another organization, but I'm just really concerned that this is the thing that just gets really a really short conversation, and leaders of color are those who suffer most from it. So I wonder if you could speak to that. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So I have this balance between kind of, the passion behind why we do this, but then being pragmatic about the execution of those values, as I already discussed. And, you touched on kind of people's comfortability in having some of these conversations. And so sometimes my sneaky way around that is by just getting to, well, this is actually, if you're committed to serving this organization, whether it's as a board director or a leader in this organization, we all want to fulfill our mission, right? So you kind of rally support in that way. And one way to rally support is, some of these soft costs, right? Like turnover and staff leaving, strong, sustaining, healthy cultures, ultimately impact, the ability for us to execute on our mission. So there's that, starting from that place, just being really clear that this is, we're living our values by supporting our teams. And then putting people through formalized programs, I think it's really just, it's an exercise in prioritizing. So, again, a lot of times people say, well, I'd love to do that, but I have to say I've been fortunate in the organization that I'm currently in, for example, that we do have the resources, the financial resources to be able to dedicate to that, but that still requires a choice. We could allocate those resources in different ways, but we have chosen as an organization to invest in our people, invest in our teams, because we see the tremendous value that brings in developing, instead to move away from this archetype of like, for example, I'm the president and CEO. It shouldn't all be about me. I want to build that team around me so that they can lift and carry this organization much more than I ever could on my shoulders. So.
Stephanie, do we have any questions from Twitter?
We do, so many, so keep them coming. So this one is one that a couple of different folks have asked in different ways. So for any of the panelists, what roles do funders have to play in shaping expectations or opportunities related to nonprofits making diversity, equity, and inclusion? And in particular, someone asked, another follower asked, sort of around who to select when investing as a part of that. So for any of the panelists or for Trina as a funder.
Well, sure, I'd be happy to start. I've had a lot of people could have a lot to say about this. We need to start investing in work led by people who are directly impacted, and start to value the leadership that they bring. And so, that means a different way of being, that maybe we're not always funding services, but we're actually funding organizing work that is led by people of color and communities of color. I think that there is some data out there that shows that funding for community organizing and social justice work actually gets a very small portion of like foundation support. That's an indication that as a sector we are moving away from the very missions and goals that we have around social justice to something else. Whether that's just about building nonprofit industry or I'm not really sure. I feel like there's lots of opportunities to reflect on that, but I feel like that's the critical opportunity that we have, is to start funding work within communities of color, led by people of color who are directly impacted by the work by the issues on the ground. And I think that there's just ways to do that. We can develop relationships with people. We can get to know a lot of our grantees, think about our relationships not as funder or grantee, but as partners. We're co-learning together. And so I think that, there's a lot of opportunities for funders also to look at their own diversity and inclusion dynamics within foundations, because it's very hard to, you got to walk the talk. So if funders really aren't, value diversity and inclusion, then do that within foundations. And we still have a lack of people of color even working within foundations. So I feel like that's an opportunity that we have.
Danny, did you want to jump in on that? No. Okay. All right. Great. Another time for a couple of questions right here, and then I saw someone over there next.
So thank you for hosting this amazing panel. I feel like I'm at church. Thank you for all the wisdom and gems that you are dropping this morning. My name is Julia Mejia, and I'm the founder of the Collaborative Parent Leadership Action Network. And as a woman who's working with parents who have lived experience trying to navigate the funding world, we have come across a lot of challenges. And so my question really lies in the fact that we've been having these same conversations for the last 30 or 40 years when it comes to trying to change communities. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation. It seems to me that there's an echo chamber when we look at funding, and oftentimes it's like the funding mafia. So it's all in who you know, and if you're not supporting a particular agenda, oftentimes people fund you based on what their values are and not what the community values look like. So I'm just wondering what kind of wisdom you can drop on that. And the other thing is that we're not talking about class, and we have to recognize our own privilege, even as Black and brown people, that we come into spaces and forget where we've come from. And I think it's important to talk about what role class plays in this conversation. I went to a meeting and had a meeting with someone who had pearls at the Omni Parker, and I was really like, wow. It really took me back to understand that I still have a lot to feel comfortable even in certain spaces. So what does that look like in preparing social entrepreneurs to navigate these spaces?
Thank you. That's a great question.
Big one.
Yeah. I'll just jump in, but I do think it's corporate, it's board, it's nonprofit. And so how does that dynamic change, right? So does it start with changing the boards? Does it start with really getting more people of color on those boards who have access to the money, who then will be more open to change within a nonprofit? I just think there's a thread that runs through it that just is hard not to acknowledge that. So that if you have people on your board that are representing those corporations, and those are people of color that you can have those conversations with and say, this is what we need. This is the funding we need for those direct service staff who are underpaid right now. And funders constantly say they're not going to fund people, yet that's where you're spending your money in a nonprofit, in people. And yet they resist it every time. So you need people that are going to speak on your behalf, right, to those corporations that are giving you the money, or those foundations, to say, hey, this is the reality check here of what's going on. Because I do understand impact, we have to measure our results, all right? But it's through people. It's always through people. And yet there's a resistance there. So I would say for an entrepreneur, social entrepreneur like yourself, that you're going to start by getting people around you that are connected to those corporations and those foundations. And the other thing I'll say is I've had a funder, a foundation, come to me and say to me in the middle of a meeting, an on-site meeting, I don't understand why you're so focused on diversity, saying those words to me, because there's no research to show that a cross-race match has any difference between a same-race match. And I say, well, so those conversations have to happen, and I think that's something we don't talk a lot about.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, Trina, do you want to jump in?
Well, I just share your frustration with how long we've been having these conversations, and things have actually gotten worse. Wealth disparities, incarceration rates, homelessness, gentrification is tearing communities apart. Things have gotten worse, and we have the data, lots of data. And we have the aspiration and the imperative, but we don't have the commitment to keep doing it. And the question about what is it going to take for people to actually just do the thing, do what needs to be done. And whether it's, I'm an idealist, and so I want to believe that people will be drawn to do it because it's better for our democracy, it's better for our world, we can right all of the wrongs that people have suffered, or maybe we just, put mandates in, but which we hope the state maybe can do. I don't know what the incentive is, but we have everything that we need to know what we need to do. Right. And the question is, why are we not doing it?
And the answer to that is because it doesn't feel right. It's not pretty. It's not nice. There's a lot of bumps in the road. Yeah, and you have to be. It's a human. We work for humanitarian, like organizations that help humans. Humans are complicated, and so it's just you have to start somewhere and not always think about it has to be perfect. Everybody has to feel right. It's not going to feel right, but it's not about making people necessarily feel right all the time. It's about how you react to that and what happens after that. After that, there's that feeling. How do you come back and jump back from that? So.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we obviously believe here at the Boston Foundation that these very conversations are part of what will lead to that change. So thank you for your courage in asking the questions and partaking in this dialogue. So we'll just go to our last question, and then I'm going to ask the panelists to each take a minute or two just to sum up any final thoughts, and we'll let you guys get on with your day.
So I just want to say what she said, what he said, what she said, what he said, what everybody said. Yes. And I want to thank the Boston Foundation for opening up this dialogue, and thank the fantastic folks on the panel who have really bestowed upon us some great knowledge this morning. My name is Sherry Kraft. I'm the founding CEO and executive director of Smart from the Start. And there's so much I want to say, but I want to ask a question. We talk about lived experience, and we talk about mining our communities for the gems, the folks who actually have the wealth of experience and knowledge and may not have the educational background to go along with that would qualify them for some of these positions. And we really make a point of trying to hire from our communities or find other ways for folks to be involved in paid positions like family leadership teams and so forth. What are we doing as a nonprofit community to make sure that we're creating avenues for folks who may have had some challenges with the criminal justice system or have other challenges to become part of this movement towards social equality and racial equality? Because what I see is a conversation about educational access and educational qualifications, but we kind of overlook the fact that we're missing a whole population of folks who have the answers to the questions that we're trying to solve, the issues that we're trying to solve, and we've got to find a way to include them in the dialogue in a real and respective way, where they're able not just to comment, participate in the focus group, but that they're in paid positions despite some of the challenges that they have that in fact are informative to the work that we're doing. So if anybody's doing anything innovative or has some ideas about that, I'd like to hear that.
Thank you. Thank you for your work and for your question. So I'm going to ask the panel to both respond and include your concluding thoughts, just so we can end on time. So Trina,
sure,
start with you.
I can totally start, and I think that this would answer both of those questions. I think that we can, first of all, start supporting alternative structures. So traditional nonprofit organizations are not the only mechanism that we have for change. There are other structures that could include folks coming out of the criminal justice system, folks struggling with all sorts of issues that are ready to make change for themselves. And what's emerging, we've got networks, we've got worker-owned cooperatives, we've got all of these coalitions. There are other things that we can get behind that people who are directly impacted want to lead, because they see it's going to make a change not only for themselves, but for the community of folks struggling with similar issues. And so we can take a risk. Those of us with capital and money in the room can make some choices about funding some of this new emerging work. We can take the risk to fund something different. And I feel like that has the potential to transform the sector, but also lift people up.
I think one of my suggestions would be a partnership. Partner with organizations that are doing that work. If you're not doing it yourself or are not sure how to get it started, through partnership, that's a way to address that. And kind of my closing thoughts is that this is very human work, right? And especially for a lot of our organizations, we really need to figure out how to intentionally include the voices of the people that we're serving in our decision making. And I will always go back to that because it's important. Like, me having been part of that community, being raised in that community, there's so many times when my mother wasn't included in the conversation, and she is the fuel for what I continue to do what I do now. And I had to do a lot of translating back and forth because she didn't feel comfortable, teachers or other people didn't feel comfortable. They were frustrated because of the language barrier. And at the end of the day, she's pushing me to do the things that I'm doing today. And so figuring out how to not come up with assumptions on like what the parents may or may not be doing, and literally try to seek out how are they helping, and why are you deciding not to go to this college versus this one? It's like the parents are involved in that decision making.
That's it. So I would just say that we want to include our little sisters in the decision making. We have a little sister board. We're asking the families to participate. And I do think it's a change in leadership, back to that question about how we lead. And I'll just say, sort of as a white woman leader, that I don't have to have all the answers. I don't have all the answers. I can't even pretend to have all the answers. That I have to make sure that the people that I work with are included in the decision making, as well as the family's little sisters. But I'll also say this, that I have power, and the power to make connections with the corporations and the board, and to use that power for those little sisters and their families. And that is my responsibility as the president and CEO of Big Sister, is to be a convener and a connector, and to share that power with the people that we're serving.
I totally share your frustration. When I worked at DCF, there's a law that requires all social workers have to be licensed, and it was kind of unenforced for many years. Then all of a sudden they decided to enforce it, and so guess what? You had a number of people scrambling to get licensed, and then disproportionate number of people of color were unable to be licensed, often because they were English language learners. So you had this value of diversity railing against like legal precedent. And now in my work at Hopewell, 99% of our revenue is through state contracts. So we're boxed in many ways by those for the sustainability of our organization. And so we're trying to move away, but it's a challenge. So I don't have many answers for you, but I share your struggle with that. But in terms of takeaways, I mean, I think at the end of the day, actions speak louder than words. We've talked a lot about those values, but it's really about action and impact. So developing a specific plan for how you're going to execute those values, I think, is critical. I think we need to support people of color in their leadership, not just by putting them in those positions, but then, giving them the professional development, access to affinity groups, mentoring and coaching in a structured way, in an intentional way. And last is to just hold and embrace the complexity of identity. So, I've been physically assaulted and profiled because of my race, but I've also been able to send my kids to private Montessori nursery school because of my class privilege. So I think there's a reality to this, that we are all on some level up and down in these power differentials, and it's important that we approach things from a place of curiosity.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking the panel. And I also want to thank Francis and Sean for coming from New York, for putting numbers to our experience. And I feel that today we've gotten closer to understanding why those numbers are the way they are and some of the things that we can do about it. But an important part, as I said, of this is continuing the conversation. So I hope we will see all of you back in early 2018 for ongoing conversations. And I'm just going to turn things over to Orlando Watkins to bring us home.
There's exactly 1 minute left, so I'm just going to say thank you all for coming. Dope, stupendous panel. Just thank you for your courage and your leadership and your example setting. I think one of my favorite quotes was "Talk is cheap," right? So we got to keep having the conversations. One of the great things this foundation is able to do from this platform is raise the conversation. But we got to keep figuring out how to take action on all the things that we've heard today. So again, thank you all for coming, and have a great day. Thank you.